knowledgeable. And in fact, Joe has really contributed a lot to my thinking over time as I came into this in 1999 knowing very little. And even at that time, Joe already had known quite a bit. And so I thank Joe for all of the wonderful work he's done for many, many years. And Millie, I know Millie's got quite a bit of background, and I'm sure I'm missing some people, but I want you to know that I realize that this is a different view of the history that you may find interesting. I would be very interested to know after I walk you through it, what you think about it. So with that, let me go on. One of the things that I'm going to sort of walk through, and this may at this point in time be a somewhat strange concept, but as I saw the overall structure, it's my view that Mr. Hershey had thought about this from early childhood and actually conceived of it quite extensively before he ever got to Hershey. And that while he was a very quiet person, if you look at the things he did and the things that people wrote about him, you'll find that actually he expressed himself much more than most people. He was just not one to write it down or to say it in a lot of words. But he had a lot to say about life. And as I walk through this, think about just that. That's me. The one thing that I want to walk through is the whole concept of when did he form this idea, because many people are somewhat confused about that. I come back to Hershey and people say, well, you know, the town was formed before the trust. And so it was the town that Mr. Hershey formed, and the trust was something he thought of later. That's not really very accurate. And I'll walk you through what I think is a more accurate description of what happened. Bear with me as I walk through some of this text. This is an article that was written in 1923. As many of you might know, Mr. Hershey did not publicize his contribution to the trust in 1918 until 5 years later, and I'm sure he had good reason for that. There are two accounts of Mr. Hershey's development of his ideas. This one talks about what the author says Mr. Hershey said. The other one talks exactly in the same terms, but what Mr. Snyder, John Snyder, said about what Hershey had done. And both of them are very specific as to when Mr. Hershey started thinking about the Hershey Industrial School. I will go through this really quickly. The author of this article wrote, "The ambition of a man to help fatherless boys, an ambition treasured through the years from apprenticeship to manufacturer." As you recall, he was an apprentice back when he was a teenager. So here's the author saying he had thought of this when he was a teenager. This is the same article. Milton Hershey's quoted as saying, "I have wanted to do something for orphans for many years, and I always had the idea of having a farm for boys in the old homestead." I always had the idea. Right? Milton Hershey went on to say, "I returned to Lancaster in 1886, and he explains that he was into caramels, and that he didn't think he'd be rich at that point in time. The author goes on to say, it was then, when Mr. Hershey in 1886 returned to Lancaster, that he began thinking about the school. And you've got to remember now, when Mr. Hershey, and I'll get into this in detail, when Mr. Hershey talks about the school, he talks about the Hershey Industrial School, and that includes the community and the businesses and the education system. And the school as we think of it today was just a part of the whole. This is the particular article that I quoted from in 1923, and then this is the article that I quote from John Snyder. Now, I want to reconcile these stories here because you'll see that, there's the thought that MS had developed an interest in forming the Hershey Industrial School early in his life. Some accounts suggest that he began to visualize the school when he was a child. Of course, the article I just quoted says it was 1886. There are some accounts that state that the origin of the idea for the school was Catherine. This is a little bit long, but the basic gist of it is to say, look, all of these things can be true simultaneously. It depends on what you're talking about. And it's my view that Mr. Hershey had an ever-increasing view of what he wanted to do, starting from early childhood notions, and then it evolved over time. And that when he married Catherine, of course, naturally he would want to include her in his vision, and he did. And so the truth is, by the time they formed the trust, they had already sort of bonded and formed joint thoughts about how that should come about. So these different types of accounts, I would hope you wouldn't take to mean that only one person can be right. I think they're all right. That, in fact, different pieces of the puzzle evolved over time. So I think that the essence of this is that after he had pretty clearly formed his impression, his ideas, and my book goes into a lot of detail about the timing of when he purchased the first logo or trademark for the business. And who would have bought a trademark for chocolate with a baby in a cocoa bean? It just doesn't really make a lot of sense. You know, if you think about marketing, what's the point of that? But it has a lot of symbolism. And chocolate itself, at that time, had a lot of nostalgia associated with it in terms of its being the fruit of the gods and the like. And I think that, and I won't get into this today, but I think that, frankly, Mr. Hershey was much more religious than most people today would make him out to be, and that a lot of what had happened was a fulfillment of his personal religious beliefs. Now, let me go into the actual structure of the trust itself. But first start with Hershey, because this is the one that many people miss. You know, Hershey, and this is in terms of the concept of the Hershey Industrial School. It represents the community of Hershey, Pennsylvania, including Derry Township and certain surrounding lands. It's really zip code 17033. That's what Hershey is. And in fact, that's exactly how Mr. Hershey documented it in a lot of writings when he was building the school. In fact, Hershey was shorthand for my land. Substantially all of the shares of the Hershey Chocolate Company were transferred to the Hershey Industrial School Trust on November 13th, 1918. Now why? That's important because just prior to that transfer, Mr. Hershey had conveyed land that, and I will show you the document, that says he was conveying the town of Hershey to the Hershey Chocolate Company. Many people don't know that, but he viewed the land that was part of Hershey as being the town, which included all of his employees, the original residents of that area, and those who worked for the education system in the school. And you couldn't buy land in Hershey unless you, buy it for the first time, unless you worked for Hershey Estates or the chocolate company. And that was not to discriminate against those who didn't. It was intended to create this symbiotic relationship between the community, the business, the education system that would allow the philanthropy to be fulfilled, which was, as the company profited, he was able to benefit everybody who was part of the Hershey Industrial School, including the community. So that in November 14th, 1918, you'll see that he talks about the fact that he was, for some years, holding the land, the legal title, in trust, personally. Now what does that say? Here's a letter where he says, I got the Hershey Industrial School Trust, but just so you know, I've been owning land myself personally in trust, my personal trust for the Hershey Industrial School. And I'll show a diagram in a little bit, but what that basically says is he had been thinking about this for a long time. And when he owned the land in trust for the Hershey Industrial School, it was before the permanent trust was ever formed. He formed the permanent trust to make everything survive his death. But up until that point in time, he didn't need the trust. He was doing it himself. And so don't mistake 1909 as being a trigger date for when the Hershey Industrial School arose. It arose long before he came to Hershey. When he was in Lancaster, he was already planning this. And he was doing things in terms of the business, holding it in trust for the Hershey Industrial School. Then, in 1918, effective as of January 1st, 1918, he expressly states that Hershey Chocolate Company is acquiring certain lands, being the town of Hershey, Pennsylvania. He believed that the community was part of the philanthropy as part of the Hershey Industrial School, not the beneficiaries, but the subject of the trust, meaning the symbiotic relationship between the employer, the employee, the community, the education system. He was developing a model for how to basically tie all of this economic and social interdependency into a Hershey Industrial School. In fact, to just tie it one more step, the children who he admitted to the Hershey Industrial School as beneficiaries of the trust, he expressly agreed by contract that their home would be situated at Hershey, Pennsylvania. Now notice he doesn't say in Hershey, like you would think of a house. He says their home is situated at. In other words, Hershey as a whole is their home. And that was the relationship that was being established, that this community, the businesses, the education system was all supporting an interdependent, self-reliant community. Here's the stock certificate itself. You'll see that M.S. Hershey owned it. It was the Hershey Chocolate Company, and that he conveyed it to the Hershey Trust Company in trust for the Hershey Industrial School. November 13th, M.S. Hershey. And this is just a typed up version. Now this is important because at this time, the Hershey Chocolate Company owns the land that constitutes the town of Hershey. Here is the document where he actually talks about conveyance of the land. He schedules all the land and he's conveying it to the Hershey Chocolate Company. And look what he says. The Hershey Chocolate Company has acquired and is taking over by conveyance from M.S. Hershey certain lands, being the town of Hershey, PA. This is the interdependence that he was building between the community, the town of Hershey, the businesses, and he wanted the community to be part of that philanthropy. Here is a letter in which shortly after he conveyed, the day after he conveys the stock, November 14th, he writes a letter to Hershey Chocolate Company, November 14th, and he says on page 2, the real estate you are acquiring, because the conveyance of land was dated not the 1st of January, but was effective as of the 1st of January of that year, 1918, to the Hershey Chocolate Company, and he says that it has for some years, the real estate you are acquiring, has for some years past belonged to the Hershey Industrial School and has been operated, managed, and controlled solely by it. The legal title to the real estate being held by me in trust, only to make conveyance of it, its use, benefit, and interest. So what he's saying is, look, the trust is what I created such that when I die, it will survive my death. In 1918, he felt that all of the components of the Hershey Industrial School were now in place, and he could make it permanent because he had tested each one of them. And the book goes into it pretty methodically. You know, he would go through a phase of determining, will the chocolate business succeed? Because without the chocolate business, there was no point in developing the Hershey Industrial School. It wouldn't have any money to operate. So he'd go through a phase of ensuring that the Hershey Chocolate Company was an ongoing, or a viable business that will go on in perpetuity as best as he could tell. But he personally would own these assets as every stage was being developed. He would own the chocolate company as an unincorporated company, and then right after a depression or after it had proved its worth, he would incorporate it to make it permanent. And he had a consistent pattern of unincorporated, it proves its efficacy in long term, and once it proves its efficacy, he makes it permanent. And he did this over and over and over again. He did it with the Carmel Company, he did it with the chocolate company, he did it with the Hershey Industrial School, creating the trust, etc. And the book walks you through the dates and the times when he did this. So, but the point that here is that the Hershey Industrial School existed before he signed the deed of trust. In his own mind, in his own personal fiduciary duty to what he called the Hershey Industrial School. Now, to go on, the Hershey Industrial School was created before 1909, as I said, through his personal ownership and trust. The trust in 1909 made the Hershey Industrial School capable of existing after MS and Catherine died. That was the point of using the trust as the method of making it permanent, so that businesses, community, education systems could all exist in perpetuity. But the only way to do that was to make it a trust that had beneficiaries as a charitable matter, because they, in fact, do have perpetual lives. In many jurisdictions, you couldn't even have a company that went beyond 100 years in some states. There was this notion that you couldn't go beyond a certain period. Now, this is a tricky part that may be a little sensitive. Hershey, Pennsylvania is not the beneficiary of the trust. It was one of the subjects of the trust as part of the Hershey Industrial School. And you're going to, as I walk through this, you're going to see that during the 60s and the 70s, actually starting as Mr. Hershey was alive, the community actually pulled out of the trust by virtue of wanting to be self-determined, by virtue of wanting to have a closed shop. It basically pulled away, and it was beyond the control of the managers. So, as the Hershey Industrial School was improved, like when the hotel was built, when the community center was built, when all of those improvements were built, they came from trust funds. Those monies came from the Hershey Industrial School Trust. Milton Hershey didn't have any money. He had put it all in the trust in 1918. So all of the 30s development came from the industrial school. And so when people say, Mr. Hershey improved the town, yeah, because it was part of the Hershey Industrial School. Now you're going to see how this fits together, and it's not quite the school as you see it today. And it'll make more sense as I show you some diagrams. Hershey Estates was used basically in 1927 to split off the non-chocolate assets so as to allow the chocolate business to become a publicly traded company and raise funding in other ways. And then from that point forward and throughout MSS Hershey, the managers pretty much managed through Hershey Estates the Hershey Industrial School. But in my mind, the Hershey Industrial School stood for Hershey as the community of Hershey, Pennsylvania. The industrial stood for the businesses, including Hershey Chocolate, Hershey Estates, etc. The funding of all these businesses came primarily from the Hersheys and the Trust. And the school system, representing the educational system, both public and those that were not public. And that's how this name came up. And the funding of these resources, including the library, the various not-for-profit organizations, were all funded through the Hershey Industrial School. Now, this is something that I hope you will enjoy, because this is the structure of the trust in 1910, as Mr. Hershey set it up, that I think most people today, if you look at any diagram today, you're going to find that you don't see this. But this is how it was set up. The control of the Hershey Trust Company was in Milton Hershey by virtue of his ownership of the Hershey Trust Company stock. Because by virtue of the ownership of the stock, he could elect the board of directors. The board of directors of the trust company elected the managers, and then together, through the Hershey Trust Company and the board of managers, and of course, since they were the same, they managed the trust company and the Hershey Industrial School Trust, as well as the Hershey Industrial School Children's Home. And Mr. Hershey really, throughout his entire life, was able to implement the Hershey Industrial School by virtue of his control of the stock. And there's a unique history associated with that as well. But on the other side, through the indentures, the various parties here, the managers, the trust, and so forth, formed relationships with the beneficiaries and the parent guardian or other authority. The book gets into the actual contract and the methodology for doing this. But basically, the trustees and the managers had fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries. And there were these other relationships that are described here. But this really, in the long run, created a great deal of difficulty for the Hershey Industrial School to survive time because it required buy-in by people who lived in Hershey. And as all you probably know, that during the 30s, for every person who was in Hershey in the teens and the 20s, there were 2 new people who came in the 30s who came as part of the Depression when 25% of all America was unemployed, and they were really worried about management. And so this fiduciary duty that was owed here to the beneficiaries caused a lot of what was going on in Hershey that maybe people didn't like to be driven by this obligation to make decisions that were in the best interest of these children. And over time, it became somewhat untenable because you had a growing number of people who didn't buy into Mr. Hershey's philanthropy and through a number of different ways wanted to be self-determined, wanted to have a closed shop at the factory, and ultimately the managers could not require the community to continue to be part of the trust. And during the 60s and 70s, it unbundled a great deal as a result of that. But this is the original structure. And I'm going to skip through a couple of these because it's basically the same thing, but if you think about it, the trust was made up of the Hershey Industrial School being what I would call the school. The deed of trust has got 3 major provisions. The first part of it talks about the board of managers, and it talks about the Hershey Industrial School, including the community, and the education system, the businesses. And then there's a section that talks also about the Hershey Industrial School as the school that really addresses the needs of the individual beneficiaries, the children that were admitted to the school. And so you have 3 entities being named, because then later in paragraph 28 of the deed, they also define an entity called the Hershey Industrial School and its board of managers. Now, that seems really confusing, and I'm going to show you a slide. But this basically shows you that when you look at this, everything that was being built, the Hershey Conservatory, the public library, the consolidated school, the central theater, HIS, the homestead, all of this, in Mr. Hershey's view, is part of the school. He wasn't concerned about if it was the children who were beneficiaries, the children who lived in the community. He was concerned about preserving this entire relationship between business, community, and the education system, because it was good for everybody. Also, it included the businesses like the Hershey Chocolate, Hershey Improvement Company, and various other businesses. And then you had, in terms of the community, you had the resident and non-resident employees that were part of the community. You had resident non-employees who had lived here before Mr. Hershey came in and bought the land. And then you had what's familiarly referred to as the school family, relating to what we now know today as the Milton Hershey School. But it had basically residential beneficiaries and non-residential beneficiaries. And the book actually walks you through this. But the next few slides talk about the way it was broken down. Here are the assets, and you can see this is the land, businesses, and other assets owned from 1910 to 1918 before he put it in the trust, because he owned it outright. So he owned the Hershey Industrial School in his personal right, because he said he had a personal trust that he was holding the assets on behalf of the Hershey Industrial School. And then here, since he had already formed the trust in 1909, some of these assets were actually owned in the trust. So until 1918, you had this 2-pronged ownership structure of the trust. Some personal and some legal. This is how it shifted over time, as in 1918, Mr. Hershey didn't need to have the personal trust anymore, and then you can see that he controls the trust by virtue of owning the stock of Hershey Trust Company and electing their board, who elects the board of managers of Hershey Industrial School Trust, and it now owns everything. And in 1918, everything from that point forward was funded through funds from the trust. And if you look at the rise and demise of Hershey Junior College, and if you look at a lot of other books that were written, they allude to the structure. Like, for instance, they observe how odd it is that the employees of the Hershey Junior College work for Hershey Estates. Well, all of the employees of the Milton Hershey School were employed by Hershey Estates. All the employees in any of the non-chocolate business were employed by Hershey Estates, because Hershey Estates was the operating arm of the Hershey Industrial School. And so, and that is what gave rise to this consistent annual retirement party amongst all the various employees of the businesses, of the school, because the view was that this was all part of the same family until recent years. In 1945, as Mr. Hershey passed, this was the structure, which was pretty much the same, except that, as you can see, there's quite a bit more by the time he passed away as part of the education system. Now, you know, today, many of those are no longer funded through the trust, and there's a good reason for it, but I'll get to that in a second. I think the easiest way to see this is in the deed of trust itself. You've got the first third of the deed talks about the school with a capital S. The second third talks about the school lowercase s. And then the last third talks about the managers and their obligations, and they're all called the Hershey Industrial School. So that nobody would be uncertain. Hershey Industrial School. What I and Ms. Hershey built to make all of these common interests a shared philanthropy through the structure. As I make more money in my business, I give you 25% of the profit, and I'm proud to do that because you're an integral part of the Hershey Industrial School. Sure, 75% of that may go to his children, but that's the way that the overall structure works. Now, if you look at this, basically, this whole circle is the Hershey Industrial School, capital S, as Mr. Hershey left it when he passed away. And it's got huge prongs. It's got the industrial component, it's got the community component, and it's got the educational component. Inside here is that lowercase school that were the assets required to address the very unique needs of dependent children who were brought into the Hershey Industrial School. They had very specific educational requirements that differed from the public school. Originally, the design was that when the kids came to the school very young, from, say, 4 to 8 years old, they would get sufficient education before they went to high school, that by the time they get to high school, they would go to the Hershey public school. And they all did. But what happened was in 1933, when it was time, when the chocolate business was making so much money, they couldn't bring in enough children with that age range. So they started bringing in children who were in like junior high or high school. And so when they came in, they had educational needs that required Mr. Hershey, as hard as it was, for him to separate them from the public school system because they needed special attention. But at the same time, he built the Hershey Junior College, because at that point, when the kids graduated from high school, they could go to college together. He was very methodic in this way, of building one step after another. He had to build the school on the hill because the kids that were being admitted had special education needs. He didn't want them to compete with the community kids because that was going to be problematic. He couldn't be certain that the kids coming to the school would get the classes that they needed. So he built the school on the hill primarily to make it possible to admit kids who were older and give them the types of education they needed that was very different from the public school system. And this was the structure that manifested itself through. Now, this is, in my mind, why, for the longest time, you saw this in Hershey. Because right here is where the managers met. The managers ran Hershey, Hershey Industrial School. Now that's changed since the 60s and the 70s. But those were the very unique facts that I learned as a result of this. And I thank Joe Burning, who's contributed immensely to that effort. But I've never seen anyone write to date how it all fit together as a whole, and how what he did every step of the way made sense. And I didn't write the book to sell books, but if you're curious about it, the book walks you through it in steps and stages, and it really explains it almost like a project manager. Like, if I wanted to succeed in this endeavor, what would I do first? How would I prove concept before I made it permanent? And that's what he did, over and over again. And then when he was proving one concept and he was moving to the other, you would see that he would do the early stages of the proof of concept of the next phase. That's what he was doing from 1909 to 1918, making sure he could put together an education system for these children who were dependent children who had special needs. And during that time, he called in some of the best experts to help shape the thoughts of what should the school look like. So that's pretty much what I have to say. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If you'd like me to cover any of the subjects, I'm happy to do that. But these were the things that I thought, in doing my research, that I thought you might find interesting that have never really been fully developed. Yes?
Who owns Hershey?
What's that?
Who owns Hershey?
Who owns the town? Well, you know, the convention historically was that the answer is nobody does. The question was, who owns Hershey today? As best as I can tell, the tradition historically was, if you had a post office, people would say, I'm from Gary Church, because that's my post office. It had no legal relevance because it wasn't a city, it was incorporated. It was just, I'm from Gary Church because that's my post office address. And that's how it evolved. Hershey was exactly the same concept, that Hershey was a postal service area that everyone referred to because that's their address. I'm from Hershey. But there is no legal entity Hershey today. And the ownership of Hershey has changed because in 1976, when they rezoned everything, the zoning went from Hershey Industrial School to a more traditional zoning methodology, recognizing that the ever-growing cost of operating the town, the electricity, the water, the subsidized resources that were made available to the community was getting out of control. And you know, I got to tell you, if you looked at the press back then, the workers and the community, they were getting fed up with being part of the Hershey Industrial School. And they pulled away. And as a result of pulling out of the equation, the trust had no choice but to say, look, if you're not going to play a philanthropic role, you can't be part of the Hershey Industrial School, because that's the whole point of the trust. You have to be committed to fulfilling the philanthropy. And I think that if you look at the press in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even before that, it had become clear that with the competition, with the boys, in terms of there being for every boy in Derry Township, there was a boy at Milton Hershey School, but there was only one girl for those two boys. The sports, the academics, the competition for jobs, it was getting to be too much. And those who were adults in Hershey didn't want it anymore. And they started forcing change. And so the managers stopped supporting it as a community. And I think that those who made the decisions back then, who wanted to be self-reliant, self-determining, they understood what was going on. But many people today really don't understand that that's really what was happening. That it wasn't the managers divesting the town. It was that the town, the people, were not committed to the philanthropy. Yes?
I was one of the people in Hershey was working, and I took over for Hershey. I was there,
Ah.
and he died of Hershey Hospital. And this idea, when he visited us, he was sitting beside me. This idea was to have something for this higher, what girls and boys for them. And that was his idea.
But of course it would be. I would agree with that. Okay.
Agree with it.
Yes, I mean,
He visited at Hershey quite often, and he loved to come see us.
Yeah, the point that was made was that Mr. Hershey had a genuine interest in those who had retired. And I think that that just goes by definition, that the Hershey Industrial School stood for the notion that you see in other cultures like Japan, that there is a life cycle and you're part of it, and this business, community, and education is really more interdependent. And now today, people in business will say, well, this is business, and that's personal. And you know what? That's really a bunch of baloney. That's just the excuse people use in business to really stick it to somebody. You know, like the commercial about sticking it to the man, but I am the man. Oh, yeah. You know, the irony is that there is no difference between business and personal. It's all personal. And business has created this illusion that there is this difference, but there's nothing to support it except something that says it. And so I think Mr. Hershey felt very differently, that everything that you do in life is service to mankind. And I think he had a much more deep religious belief than most people would give him credit for.
He was a Mennonite background.
And he said,
Mennonite.
yes, and he said that that he was born and all of his life he has been a Mennonite, just like his mother. Yes, and in fact the book quotes him on that. He viewed himself throughout his life as a Mennonite. In fact, when the Catholic Church came to get funds from him, he said, "What would the Catholic Church need me for? You know, I'm a Mennonite." Mr. Stark. I should also give some credit to Craig Stark. I didn't see him earlier. But he also helped me quite a bit when I knew very little about Hershey. He helped me quite a bit understand it, including Mr. Hershey's history and his relatives and some of the very unique things. In fact, Craig and I and Joe would often try to figure out how all this stuff fit together, because when you look at the pieces, they seem to be inconsistent until you start seeing different pictures, such as I showed you by diagram and the actual documents. It wasn't until after 2002, I requested copies of the transfer documents in 1918, and the trust gave me a copy of them. And those were the documents that were the most revealing, because those documents say a lot about what Mr. Hershey was doing. And today you'll find it very hard to get anything that's really credible information about exactly what he was doing. Any other questions?
Yes, I'd be interested in your interpretation of how the junior college
How it disappeared?
yeah. I missed it by 2 years. Start with Gilbert Nurk.
Well, I gotta say that I can't tell you exactly how it happened, but I can tell you why I think it happened. I think it happened because when Mr. Hershey created the Hershey Junior College, part of the program was vocational. And it was intended that the kids from the Dairy Township High School and the Milton and the Hershey Industrial School would go to the junior college and get on-job training. But the workers in Hershey wouldn't stand for it. And they forced the kids back into the school, industrial arts labs and all that stuff. They couldn't work in the businesses. They forced them out as a labor issue. The answer in my mind is that the combination of wanting to be self-determined and the desire to have a closed shop, driven mostly by adults, forced the efficacy of the community as being part of the Hershey Industrial School down to zero. It just became impossible, but it was very costly. And I think that what happened is that in trying to figure out how to do it, the Hershey Junior College was one of those assets that was heavily subsidized by the trust and the chocolate company, and yet had no direct connection to the businesses. And so what happened was they replaced the Hershey Junior College with scholarship programs at the companies, so that if you worked at the companies, you could send your kids to college, but it wasn't there as a resource for people who were in Hershey who weren't working for the businesses. And some of that arose because, you remember I said, until like the 1940s after Mr. Hershey died, you couldn't buy land in Hershey unless you were part of the workforce. You were part of the Hershey Industrial School. And that was an odd thing. And a lot of people wanted to live in Hershey because it was a beautiful community to live in, but Mr. Hershey wouldn't stand for it. And the managers in the mid to late 40s approved the first purchase, and that really was a fundamentally bad decision, because if there was going to be interdependency between the community and the businesses on a long-term basis, you can't just let everybody in and then support them if they're not also working at the plant, because it creates this economic imbalance. You've got more people to provide power to, electricity, phone, at subsidized rates, so you're just basically paying them to live in your community, and they're not part of the overall philanthropy. So I think that what happened was it, like many of the other really good things that were created as part of Hershey, went by the wayside when the community pulled away from the trust and the control of the managers, because let's face it, because the managers were obligated by law to exercise discretion in the best interest of children, who sometimes were at odds with the children at Hershey and sometimes the adults in Hershey. Ultimately, what was happening was that they were getting less and less receptive to that, and so they pulled away. And Hershey Junior College is an example of how once they did, you really couldn't fund it anymore as a matter of trust law.
If Milton Hershey had continued to live, did he have plans to go beyond the junior college, to have further schooling and with it the vocational idea, and also to work in the general business?
My research shows that he intended to make the 2-year or 4-year college, and that he did intend to have additional educational, vocational schooling. That was his mindset. I mean, he wasn't about how much schooling. He was about, what do you need to provide children today so they can succeed? He wasn't worried about the cost. He was worried about the effectiveness of it. And so his philanthropy was not about cost saving. It was about being effective. And so the junior college was to be a 4-year college because he knew it was going to be necessary at some point for kids, both in Derry Township, in the public, and those at the, we call it Milton Hershey School. It would be necessary for them to have a college education, for them to reach their full potential according to their own interests. And so it was inevitable. So yes, it's pretty clear from what I've read that he planned it to be a 4-year school, and then what happened was there was this falling out between the community and the managers.
John, does the Derry Township Public School get any benefits from the trust?
Today, I don't know the answer. Joe?
There are 3 trusts. There's Milton Hershey School Trust, which is for the sole use of the school. And there's the M.S. Hershey Foundation, which is for culture and education. And there's a testamentary trust. There's only 3 trusts he ever established. The testamentary trust is everything he owned on his death that directly benefits the education in Derry Township. So, no, the school, the community Derry Township School should not get anything from the school.
Well, at one time they did though, didn't they?
Through Hershey Estates,
Yeah.
which he
Originally, when the community was part of the Hershey Industrial School. And I'm using that intentionally because I don't want to get too much into the current issues. You notice I'm staying away from the current issues because they're a lot more problematic. But when it was part of the Hershey Industrial School, those other 2 trusts, in my mind, were just subsidiaries of the bigger trust. That they were established at the time because people in Hershey, and Paul Reed in particular, had written a piece that said, don't forget us, give the managers broader discretion to make sure we're taken care of. And so the 35 Trust was in part a response to the 33 memo of Paul Reed that got into all those issues. And when ultimately there was this splitting apart, you might anticipate that those other 2 trusts now have only got their own funding, and there's no additional resources in the other trust, of which they were part, like everything else was part of it. So there's nothing else there to back them up. So my understanding is they're just simply not sufficient, except for the huge contribution in 1963.
John, from what I understand, when the school was originally built on the hill, it was built with restroom facilities for girls, with the intention that girls would have attended school up there. But Mr. Hershey wanted to teach trades, and he did not want to be dictated to by the state on the qualifications of the teachers. In other words, for teaching the trades, he wanted the best tradesmen that he could get to teach that particular trade. And if they weren't certified by the state, then they couldn't be the way it was. But in as much as it was a private school, that's why it became the way it did, so that he could teach the trades up there with instructors not necessarily being state qualified.
I have not read anything to that effect, but I wouldn't be surprised because in 1933, as this was being built, he did go to the court and ask for relief to expand the age of the kids who could be admitted. He could have at the time said, we're having problems and we think now is the time to admit girls, which would have been a logical conclusion. Rather than expand the age for boys, he could have admitted girls. But I've seen nothing to that effect, but I could see how he might have been toying with that idea. Yes?
Was that year, 1918, significant in that, wasn't that the year that Hershey was developing Hershey Cuba, and it was the First World War, and I suppose that we thought that something might happen? He was down in Switzerland at that time.
Yeah, I could pull it up here. I have a timeline that sort of walks you through different simultaneous events like the war and depressions and recessions. And if you look at what was going on at the time, you will see that 1918 made sense. Catherine had passed away. The war had ended. And it was just shortly after the war ended they did it. He must have been confident in his mind that contributing substantially all of his wealth to the Hershey Industrial School Trust made sense at that time, because once he did it, he wasn't ever going to get it back.
Right.
And so, if you look at what he did when he first formed the caramel business, and he didn't incorporate it until much later, then after a recession, he incorporated it. Then same thing with the chocolate business. After a recession, he incorporates it. So, because basically some event would occur where he'd get a little bit antsy, or he's already tested the concept enough, because it was usually in 8-year periods when he would do things. It seemed to me to be that was his threshold of having proved the efficacy of a concept, and then he goes to the next stage, which is to make it permanent, forming the business, incorporating as a company, or putting substantially all of his wealth into the trust.
This time he bet on the futures, on the sugar.
That was 1920, 21. It was a little bit later.
Later.
But it was, it was during that time when he went through a lot of soul searching, but he had already contributed his wealth to the trust before that happened.
John, you had explained about transition from Hershey to college, explaining that it's because it got too complicated for the managers to see lazy trying to determine how to manage it. Because at the same time in history, you're making a statement that these folks said it was too expensive to operate a junior college. You take $50 million and convert it to another source that should not have been here.
The real fact was, the question is this really, the question was, you, John, suggested that the community was becoming too expensive to carry the cost of it. And yet they had $50 million shortly thereafter to give to the Penn State. I think what I said first was that the community had already pulled away from the philanthropy, and that those were the precipitating events. They didn't want to be determined by the managers. They wanted to have a closed shop. They wanted to have more of the profits from the businesses. There was a lot going on in the community itself where they were pulling away. And I think at some point, there was a switch flipped. Yeah. That somebody said, you know, this is really expensive, and if you're not going to be part of the philanthropic endeavor, then what's the point of funding all this? So you're right. But it wasn't that they didn't have the money. It was that I think that, and this is just my view of what happened reading about what was going on with the labor strikes. You know, like there was a labor strike the longest in the history of the chocolate company, 53, at the same time that they stopped indenturing. Most every event where there's a fundamental shift in the trust follows on the heels of something that relates to the labor strikes and the labor union negotiations and the community's protest of being under the control of the managers making all the decisions for them. They wanted to be self-determined. So it's really, in my mind, it's that all of these events were spelling, you know, Hershey community is not really, doesn't want to play the role of home, even though you may own the land. And therefore, why spend all this money?
Is there also a coincidence also being established at
Yeah, I think they're all clearly interrelated events. Jerry?
Yeah, in 1963, there was a movement across the country for establishing community colleges that would be related to the various states. That was taking place, and at the same time, they had this movement to divert funds from the deed of trust to establish the medical school. So I think there was an interrelationship there, what was happening, and particularly since Gilbert Norick and the others found, and it's a matter of record that, as I understand it, that he was advised by a legal firm, I think from New York, that what they were trying to do was not legal, and yet they went ahead and without making it known publicly that there should be a court hearing and so forth, that they just didn't do it. Joe, I think you're the one that said that they put in the request for that change, and it was only like a day later that it was signed off. And there's a few other cases that I think you told me about like that. So I think these things all came together and had an impact on this.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things that I point out in the book were bad ideas. Not so much because I'm trying to determine whether or not it was an appropriate use of money, but just the managers didn't use the right legal process. And so 63 is a really good example of where the money should have never really been used for that purpose. And that was probably one thing, even if it was well-intentioned, that was really poorly thought out on the part of the managers. And so the only way that I could see it made any sense was this, that as the community was being changed in terms of its relationship with the trust, that this might have been some sort of a, quote, settlement payment, in that the community was saying, we should be getting something out of this trust. And they said, well, what about a world-class medical school or medical facility? In my mind, that might have been some of what was going on, but there are lots of other ways to view it. But because they were pulling away from, the community was pulling away from the managers, there is that possibility that there was more going on. But they didn't follow a legal process, which was very problematic in my mind.
your observations? What was the political environment like in the township of Denver? Was it a strong one, a weak one? Was there even?
I'm sorry, which particular observations are you referring to?
You just have a sheet of there's observations. I think one of the years you said was 18 years. Go back to 1989. Milton Hershey first established Hershey Industries. What was the political environment like in the township area? How strong was it?
I think in 1918, the community was pretty much a solid community, and that Mr. Hershey's decision was mostly about, was this the right time where I want to contribute substantially all of my wealth to this trust and this philanthropy permanently? And he made that decision. He didn't tell anybody for 5 years, so I don't know what the political environment was at that time, but everything I've read suggested that it was pretty symbiotic between him and the community. And I can't really describe it since I didn't live it. And it wasn't really written about in terms of how we would think of politics today. So I don't know how to answer that.
I was just wondering, as the community started pulling away with because the political environment started strengthening, creating resistance.
There was a lot that happened, even while Mr. Hershey was alive, that's changed the chemistry of the community. So a lot had to happen before they pulled away.
This is kind of selfish, but is there anyone else in here besides me who graduated from the first year of junior college? If there is, we better get together. We may not see each other anymore.
I just want you to know, I wish I had graduated from first year of junior college.
This is a segue, really different from what you're talking about, but in your book, Milton Hershey always gave his units names, and I thought I knew most of them until you mentioned one named Recourse. And I had to call Joe Garvey and say, where was this unit? Could you just talk a little bit about that unit? Because I thought that was a very interesting name. In your book, you specified why that one was set up.
Yeah, as I recall, recourse was sort of like the last opportunity before you were kicked out of the school to sort of make amends or you were going to be booted. Now, if they got rid of recourse before I went to the school, I probably would have been one of the students there. Anyone else? Yes.
To make this whole thing work, it seemed that Mr. Hershey would have had to educate the community that this is why we had the lumberyard, the average park, and to make it all work, we had to work together. And I was there in the 60s, and it was kind of like the town against the Hershey estates and the Hershey interests. Did he try to do anything to say, this is my vision, that we have to work together as a community to make a very unique community out of Hershey?
You know, if you read a lot of what Mr. Hershey wrote, you'd find that he would do that. His philosophy was that I make a product that makes its own demand by virtue of its value to the consumer. And he would not be one to go out and champion his own ideas. He would build it, create the value, and let people enjoy it. I think that by the 60s, the community aspect of what he had built no longer had his close touch or his identity associated with it. So by then, it was different. And so I wouldn't be surprised to learn in the 60s that there was a fundamentally different conversation going on. But I don't think during his lifetime he would be one to actually talk about his purpose, because I think that it was deeply spiritual, and that if he talked about it, it would be inconsistent with fulfilling his obligations as a Christian. That's my view. Any other questions?
You put it to know that I was out there when that
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. We do have